Well, let me just start by saying thank you for being here. I know that on a Saturday that you could be a lot of different places. And if you have kids or grandkids, then you certainly have other places that you could be. And so I appreciate you being here. I appreciate the elders at the congregation here for the invitation and the opportunity to come and share some things with you. It's been interesting, this whole leadership project concept, because about 8 years ago, I was invited, a little over 8 years ago, to go and teach at Bear Valley in Denver. And when I went out there, I was really going to develop a Master's in Missions program. That was kind of the intent. And then one of the professors there died. And so they asked me to take some of his classes, and so I did. And then they had another class that was scheduled, and something happened and it fell through. And so the academic dean came over and was talking to me, and I was like, so what are you telling me all this for? And he goes, well, I was wondering if you had any ideas as to a class that should be taught here. And I said, yeah, we need to be teaching leadership here. And so anyway, we talked a little bit about it, and I'd never taught leadership at that point. I'd done a lot of studying and a lot of reading, but I'd never actually taught the class. And so we developed a class, and I started teaching that 8 years ago. And over the course of time, it began to develop more and more. And then I got into school and started studying on a full-time, not really a full-time basis, but it felt full-time, but started actually taking classes that involved developing leadership. And the more I've studied it, and the more I've thought about it, and the more I've met with congregations and various people around the country, the more I see the need for it. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. My wife and I, Cheryl, and I have been married for 35 years, and we have 3 children that are all grown and married, and we now have, as of Monday night, we have 10 grandchildren. And so let me tell you, of all the places we could be today, this is a great place. But I'm telling you, I'd sure like to be holding that baby. He's a dandy. But we have 10 grandchildren, and we love them, and that's really the reason we moved to Louisiana. We have 2 of our 3 that live there, and our 3rd's moving there next year. And so we'll have all 10 of those grandchildren close. And so the school at Bear Valley was gracious enough to allow me to continue to teach through Skype and to do some intensive short course material work. And so that's a part of what I'm doing, and I'm very appreciative of that. But today we're going to focus on leadership. I appreciate Kerry and being able to visit with him and to discuss some ideas, not just around leadership, but just the church in general, that has helped me and challenged my thinking, and it's made me appreciate him in a lot of ways. And so I look forward to growing in that relationship as we continue to go through the time that God gives us here on this earth. And if the material that I can share today is of benefit to you, then that's great. But when I look around this room, I see men that have far more experience and far more understanding in probably the field of leadership than I do. And so I hope that as we go through this day, it will not just be one-sided. I want to share some things that I've learned and some things that I've prepared to share with you. And I hope that's beneficial. At the same time, I hope there's information that you can share with me, because I would like this to be an opportunity for me to learn as much as it is for all of us to learn together. And so that we can maybe address some things that will help the church as we move into the future. In 1972, a brother by the name of Wendell Winkler wrote a book entitled Leadership, the Crisis of Our Time. Now, you think about how long ago that was when that book was written, and we're living in another generation now that is probably even more so facing this crisis as we think about the church and the future of the church and the leadership within it. There's a gentleman there in Louisiana who's written a couple of different books. And he talked about in his most recent book, and I can't remember the title of the book, but anyway, he talked in a section in that book about leadership. Primarily, he did some research to where he was looking at and trying to find out, among the churches of Christ in this country, how many of those congregations have elders. And then among those that do have elders, how many of them have, what number of elders in each congregation. What he found out through his research was that somewhere between 60 and 70% of the congregations in our country do not have elders. Now think about that for just a moment. When you're talking somewhere between 60 and 70% of the congregations that do not have elders, what does that say about the crisis of our time? And among that 30 to 40% that do have elders, the majority of them have minimal elders serving, 2, 3. And obviously there are going to be some that have more than that. But the general average of member to elder ratio is somewhere between 75 and 150 members per elder to try to shepherd the flock. And what scares me the most when I think about this crisis that we're facing in this country is that, and I don't want this to sound bad, because I believe, obviously, that we need to be training preachers. There are pulpits in this country that are empty, and they don't have preachers. But what concerns me the most is the fact that if we don't start redirecting our focus in areas of leadership development, that we're going to end up without more congregations that are without elders in them. And we're either going to have congregations that either have limited or weak elders, or we're going to have congregations that are following a wrong model biblically when it comes to leadership. And so we need to be very careful and strategic about the direction that we're taking when we think about leadership, and certainly when it comes to elders and deacons and the direction of the church for the future. And there are a lot of reasons that we could use, but just when I think about my experience, I'll be 56 years old this year. I was raised in the church. My dad was a preacher. And so I've been around the church all my life. And especially in working in environments overseas, in dealing with schools that were established by Bear Valley in 17 different countries, 23 different locations. Working with brethren in those facilities and training people to go out and teach the gospel to their own culture, their own people. And then visiting congregations across this country. And thinking about the challenges that are before us when it comes to the future of the church and the leadership within the church and the need that exists. I did a seminar. In fact, it was my very first seminar with a congregation. There was about 700 members in that congregation. They had 4 elders. 4 elders. We had about 35 that showed up that day for the seminar. And as we went through the day, we had a break, and one of the young men there, was about 30 years old, came up to me. And he said, "What do you do in a situation where we're looking at, we've got men who serve as elders, and there are not enough of them. But he said, we've got a group of men between about 40 and 55 years of age who do nothing. They don't serve in the congregation. They just sit in the pew. They just come and sit. And then they have this group between about 25 and 40, somewhere in that bracket, in that particular congregation. And he said, we don't know what's going to happen. Because when our elders are gone, who's going to fill their shoes? And it made me begin to think, really, we really are serving in a time where there's a generational gap that we're facing, and potentially not having any elders in the church. So what are we doing? How are we approaching that? How are we going to deal with the challenges that we face of preparing men to serve as elders? Now, I want to ask you a question, and I'd like for a show of hands. How many of you personally, as an individual, how many of you have encouraged a young man to become an elder in the future? How many of you? Raise your hands. So we've got about 6, 7 people that have personally been involved in encouraging someone to grow up and to prepare themselves to be an elder in the Lord's church. And the sad reality is, that's probably a large number compared to most. We just don't think about it. But if we don't start thinking about it, if we don't start addressing this crisis and getting young men groomed and prepared to serve in that position in the future, it doesn't happen by accident. And so we need to be preparing and thinking about how we're going to move forward. And so it raises this question: why should we study this subject? Well, I've painted a pretty bleak picture, and one that we need to really address. The need is great. So why should we study this subject? Now, in your folders, you have a handout. And most of the slides, I was talking with Daniel, I talked to Carrie yesterday. It's funny, I'm continually studying. I'm continually reading, and every time I read a new book, I think, man, I need to incorporate that in the material. And then I think about, well, I need to take that out. And so most of what we're going to look at today that you'll see on the screen is on the handout. So you can kind of follow along, and if you want to take some additional notes, please do. And if you want to write down some questions. Now, we're going to do, officially, we're going to do the Q&A at the end of the day. But if you have a question along the way that just comes up immediately, please don't hesitate to ask. I mean, I don't mind entertaining the question along the way, and maybe we can get feedback from others in the room as to how maybe to address some of those things. But while I have a lot of material to cover, it's not so much that we don't have time that we can address what we need to along the way. But why is it important for us to study this subject? Now, initially, I wrote down the 5 areas that you have on your handout. We need this because it's God's design for the church. And certainly we know that when we look in Scripture from the Old Testament to the New Testament, God has always had someone that served in a position of leadership for His people. Whether it was kings or prophets or men like Moses, whatever it was in the Old Testament. And then when we come into the New Testament, we know that He designed the church with those initially that were apostles and prophets and evangelists and pastors and teachers. And we know all of that from Ephesians chapter 4. So we know that God designed leadership. And then when we think about the home and the world that we live in, and especially when we think about the breakdown of the home, well, that tells us even more about the need for us to follow a design that God intended from the beginning. Eric Owens is preacher for the Avondale congregation just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And he's written a book, and I'm not sure if it was a year ago or when it was, but it's entitled, Do You Take God? And it's a book about marriage. But it goes back to the very beginning and the design that God had in place from the beginning for the marriage relationship, for the home, and the leadership that He placed upon men in that position. And so it's an incredible resource, and I would encourage you, I've kind of ventured around and looked at the library, and I know you say have some books here on the home. It'd be one to add to your library, because it's certainly a book that really deals with what God intended for the home and leadership within the home. But as well, when we think about the church, and we've already touched on the crisis that exists, we know that we need to study leadership for that reason. And certainly when we think about the world that we live in, you know, we need those who recognize the importance of leading people out of darkness into light. And so we need to do that. We were talking earlier about the program here, and it's bring, teach, keep. Is that right? And the idea of bring, teach, and keep, the whole evangelistic thrust of what the Great Commission is about, that's about leadership. It's about leading people to know the Savior. And if our world truly is going to follow someone, then it's our responsibility to lead them to know Jesus. And then, if there is one answer that rules them all, it's the last one. Why we study this subject is because eternity matters. And if we could ever convince people, if we could convince Christians of the reality and the essential importance of eternity, then maybe it would change the urgency of leading people to know the Savior, to have Christian homes that are built on the foundation of God, and having leadership within the church. So here's what happened. So I was working on this material, and I was thinking about when I really started looking at these answers and thinking about why we need to study this subject, I began to realize that really our lives are compartmentalized. We basically break our life down into 3 separate categories. We have home, world, and church. Now we realize that people in the world only have home and world. But there are 3 categories that our life really breaks down into. And the sad part is we oftentimes try to categorize them separately. We have our home life, we have our work or our life in the world, and then we have the church. And we keep them all separate. But in reality, they all overlap. And they all influence each other. And when we talk about the home, we're talking about obviously the relationship between husbands and wives. That's the home component. And we're talking about parents and children, and of course the leadership that goes along with that. When we talk about the idea of the world, it breaks out down into 2 categories also. So, because we're talking about what we do for a living, so we're on the job, we're at work, and we're at work anywhere from 40 to 70 or 80 hours a week. I mean, we have opportunity in the work environment to influence many people. But it also involves our role in the community. Because certainly when we think about the world that we live in, our responsibility is leading people in the community that we are around. And that, I mean, when you think about the Great Commission, and I know you've heard this before, this idea of go into all the world and make disciples. And sometimes we tend to think that means go somewhere else, like on the other side of the planet. And I've seen people that will spend literally thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to go overseas to preach the gospel. And I think that's great. It might surprise you, but in 2006, there was like $1.6 billion spent in short-term mission work. That's a lot of money. And the part that baffles me is the fact that we'll spend all this money to go around the world and we won't walk across the street. There's something wrong with that picture. And so we've got not just work, but we've got our community, our neighbors. And then when we think about the church, obviously it involves 2 areas as well. Because it talks about what God designed for the church and the leadership that exists within the church. But it also involves our brethren and the relationship that we have with our brethren. And in the heart of that is leadership. That's what influences it all. So I designed this. Now, from this angle, I'm not sure if it's showing through, but on the screen on my laptop, you'll see in the center of this, it's kind of grayed out a little bit. But I have what I call this formative evaluation ring. Formative evaluation is a term that is used to really describe ongoing. I mean, it's just constantly being evaluated. So when we look at our life within our homes, or we think about our life at work, or we think about the church, we need to constantly be evaluating our life in relationship to those areas, and specifically our leadership within them. And then when you really look at it, you'll see that in this grayed out area that really encompasses everything within that formative evaluation ring, that's our Christianity. And we often talk about it, but we don't often really think about how significant it is that Christianity has to infiltrate, penetrate, if you will, every area of our life. Home, world, and church. Christianity is not just what happens within the 4 walls of the church building, but it has to be the basis for which we build our homes, and it has to be the basis of our influence at work. People are watching us. So when we think about why it is so significant that we study this particular subject, this to me this sums it up. And we need to constantly be evaluating our life, our example, our role, the influence that we have when it comes to leadership in the three categories that our life from birth till death involve: home, world, and church. Now, several years ago, I met a gentleman. Actually, he just became a Christian about 10 years ago. And I met him about 2 years after he became a Christian. He's a retired CEO from Western Union. He actually took Western Union when they were deep into the red and brought them back into the black. I mean, he's an incredible leader. His name is Doug McNary. And Doug McNary made this statement: an organization cannot grow beyond the strength of its leadership. I asked him if he would come in and teach the guys there at Bear Valley and do a particular course in which he would focus on leadership for them and help them to see the correlation between some of the principles of leadership within the world and specifically the corporate arena, and how that played a factor within the church. And so he did that. And he always began by giving a bit of history about how he became a Christian and how he didn't feel qualified to even be involved in teaching in a Christian environment. But then he would make this statement. And think about that. When you really begin to look at that pole that arises that we're going to call leadership, and you think about the growth of the church that comes out here, when that pole begins to lay down, the church cannot grow, it can never grow beyond the strength of its leadership. And one of the reasons why the church is not growing today is because it lacks leadership. And if we're going to grow the church, then everything, as John Maxwell says, rises and falls on leadership. Now let that sink in, because it's true. If we're going to grow, we're going to have to raise up some leaders. Another quote that John Maxwell makes, which I just love. He says, if you want to grow, lead followers. But if you want to multiply, lead leaders. And that's true too. Powerful stuff. So let's talk about defining leadership. Here's our task. Here's what we're going to do for the next few minutes. This would be the time, Daniel. Daniel's going to hand out a sheet, basically per table. You might want to work with the guys here behind you. Those of you who are sitting kind of single to yourself at a table, get with somebody either close to you, one to the side or behind you. So I want each table to take about 5 minutes or so. What I want you to do is I want you to think about and discuss among yourselves, how would you define leadership? What word, if you were going to take one single word, what would that word be? I want you to write it out on this sticky stuff that Daniel's handing out. But not only do I want you to write the word that you would use to describe leadership, and I'll explain the purpose behind this after we come back together, but I want you to write a sentence that defines leadership using that word. Does that make sense to everybody? So be thinking about what one word would you use to describe leadership? And then what sentence would you give to define leadership based upon and using that particular word? And then what I'll do is I'll share a word with you or a sentence that I've used to define leadership based upon some things that I've studied just a little bit. Any questions in regards to that? We'll just take about 5 minutes, not too long, but be thinking about it. And we're going to hand out some paper here that you can write on. And put that information together. Do they have markers, Daniel? He's got the answer. I like it. Say, I know. He's going to turn around and work with them. So I think there's just another two. Thank you. Leadership already started. I like it.
If you can't find space on your table to write, and you want to go to a wall area, it'll stick on the wall and you can write on it as well.
Where would that bottle of water be? I'll get it. Thanks.
First thing came to mind for me but it's not.
I was in Honduras and Guatemala about a month ago, and the thing that I noticed is one church had elders, one church that I went to, and we went to
Perfect. Thanks.
congregations every single day that I was there, different congregations, and one preacher preached at 3 congregations on Sunday, and then during the week preached at the congregations, some of them the same ones that would go back.
Right.
One preacher preached at 2 congregations every Sunday, but they had a lot of congregations because they don't have the transportation that we have here, and so they're smaller congregations. There'd be 20, 25. We went to a couple of them that had over 100, but most of them are 25 to maybe 40, 50. But no leaders. The largest congregation that I went to had 12 men in the congregation. All the rest were children and women.
Yeah.
But the leaders, I talked to one man that they said went all the time, but he wasn't a leader. He wasn't even a member. He just went to church all the time.
Wow.
But he said, well, before I die, I'd probably go back. But it's strange the way that they look at people. The men just aren't really interested.
And I think that's the saddest part about this. And that's how we've deviated from the design that God intended. And as a result, I mean, it's influenced the home, it's influenced the church, and it's not just in this country, it's the whole world. And when I look at the places that I've been around the world, various places where the schools are established and talking to various men who are involved in that, same situation. It doesn't matter whether it's Africa or Cambodia, I mean, Ukraine, Central and South America, it's the same everywhere. And we've strayed from the plan that God gave us. And as a result, we're seeing problems. We see problems in the church, we see problems in the home. And so,
And the women, and we would have meetings every single night. We'd have meetings at one of the congregations or in someone's home. And we'd have 40, 50 women that would show up.
yeah,
And maybe 2 men. And the 2 men, of course, the women there would be a woman teaching.
yeah.
And so they wouldn't be there. They'd be just walking around the house or
Yeah.
walking around the church building. We're even involved.
Yeah, we got to fix that. And while I agree that preacher training is a good thing, and these men are being trained to go out and preach, but the sadness of it is they're going out to preach and teach, and the congregations are still women and children, and they are the only man
Yes.
involved in it. And so they become a pastor.
That's the system that's there.
Yeah.
The pastor system.
Yeah.
And I noticed some of the preachers which were really doing a good job. Like really, they had taken over pastor show. And
Yeah.
it's wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's a good thought. Hopefully we can turn that around. Yes?
Have you ever been to Ghana?
To Ghana? I have. I have been several times.
We've done intensive work on Ghana.
Okay, where at?
Well, we first started off down south, but it was like Nashville, you know, a church on the,
Right?
you know, Christian Expo.
Name doesn't sound familiar.
He,
We worked in Takoradi and in Tamale. Those were the two towns that we worked in. Tamale was in the north. Takoradi is kind of the southwest part of Ghana.
ran south to Indies, basically settled down.
Okay.
But it was just amazing to see how thirsty.
Well, there's a congregation in Accra that has elders, but they're the only one that I'm aware of in Ghana that has elders. In Suam Road.
In Swan Road, I think Timma has it there.
Which one? Timma? Yeah, see, I'm not familiar with all the churches over there, just the ones that we were directly either connected with or we knew somebody in that helped us. But I knew Insuam had elders, and they are stronger as the church in Ghana than most countries in Africa.
Kamasi had them at one time.
Muncie?
Kamasi.
Kamasi. Yeah. There was a lady that died. Do you remember Avril? Avril, she was a lady that was a nurse that served there in Kamasi. I was one of the last people to see her alive. She was electrocuted. She grabbed a hold of a shower head. And of course, it wasn't grounded, and it electrocuted her. But I'll tell that story later. But she was an interesting lady. Yeah. Okay. Y'all have been talking, haven't been writing. Write something down. I'm going to give you a chance to write while I go around the room. Okay. Let's come back together. We're going to share some of what you have written. So, you've had a chance to think about how you would define leadership. What word would you use to describe leadership? And give us a sentence using that word to define leadership. We're going to start right over here. You guys are kind of in the cubby hole, and I saw you finish writing.
That's what an engineer does. Best performs at the last minute.
All right, I like it. What word did you come up with?
Motivator.
Motivator, okay.
The ability to motivate a group above their current level of performance.
Very good. The ability to motivate a group beyond their level of performance. All right, I like it. Very good. What word did you guys have?
We picked vector, the idea of like not just a path, but like momentum and movement along.
Nice.
Daniel. Yeah, there you go. Our sentence is leadership requires vision of a goal and momentum toward that goal along a specific vector.
Nice. Very good. That's a first. I like that. Very good. Were you guys in that, or did you have a separate one?
We had a separate.
Okay. What'd you come up with?
Persuasion. Leadership is defined as the ability to positively and powerfully persuade and motivate one to accomplish one goal and vision.
Very good. Man, this is rich stuff. We'll come to the front from the back. What do you guys got?
We have respect.
All right.
That leadership is earned through the respect of the followers.
Nice. That's good too.
That's correct.
That is correct. I like that.
I respect that.
That's very good. All right, you guys?
Okay, we came up with example,
All right.
and our sentence was, as leaders of God's church, we strive to be examples of integrity and service to encourage and grow the flock.
Very good. Very good. I see your word from here. Go ahead.
We've got inspire. Someone inspiring people shows leadership.
Very good. Man, this is awesome. You got a lot of words.
Yeah, we got a whole bunch of words. We spent too much time debating the words. So we got servant, courage, motivate, Christ-like, teacher, but we never put it all into a sentence.
I think we put it all together as saying it's a leader is Christ-like in having all of those attributes.
Okay.
And being able to
Servant, courage, motivate,
Lead by example.
Christ-like, teacher. Okay. You could actually make that a sentence, so that's good.
Example,
Example, okay.
a leader leads by example.
Very good. Very good. Leads by example.
Servant, a leader humbling themselves by example to serve others.
Very good. Man, that's a Philippians 2 thought, isn't it?
Visionary. A visionary exercises influence on others with passion and integrity to achieve strategic goals and objectives. And that's business-like.
I like it. I like it. I think I've read something kind of like that in a textbook. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, footnotes at the bottom.
Okay, good. And references at the end. No, that's good. And it is. It's very good. Did you guys have one, or do we go over here? Over here. Okay.
Our word is guidance, and our sentence is leadership is providing word pictures and actions that direct the correct steps of the followers.
Very good. Man, this is rich. Rich stuff. Some obviously overlap, but the ideas are there. And the reason I do this exercise is because of a couple of reasons. One is it helps us to see that it's hard to nail down one specific definition. Out of all the books that I've read, I've never read any two that specifically said exactly the same thing for defining leadership. I mean, there are different words that characterize what we see when we think of leaders, and that concept of leadership and how that plays out within different environments. One of the exercises that I require students to do is I divide them up in groups of 4, and I have them take a list of 15 questions that are already prearranged, and each one is to interview somebody different. One in that group has to interview an educational leader, one has to interview a political leader, one has to interview a religious leader, and one has to interview a corporate leader. And then they have to come together and they have to start looking at their answers and comparing and looking at the similarities and the differences. And I was telling Daniel yesterday, one of the questions that they have to ask is, what's more important to your organization? Mission, vision, or values? And then why? And it's interesting to see which one of those is most important to which leader and their organization. But the other reason I do this is because when we think about leadership as a whole, there are so many different approaches that when we come to the church, we tend to separate it out as something completely different than anything else in the world. And because we've approached it that way, it's left us with some challenges that we're needing to face. Now, over the years, I've read a number of different books. I actually put together a number of slides, and it takes all day to go through them, so we're not going to do it today, but I'll just tell you real briefly. I started studying leadership from 1920 to the present. And I started looking at the President of the United States who served the longest during that period of time. Obviously, every decade is going to end up with at least 2. But I looked at who it was that served the longest during that particular decade, from 1920 to the present. And I took down and I started looking at what circumstances they faced, not just in this country, but on a global level. What was going on in the world, or what was going on in this country? And then I looked at how leadership was defined during that decade. And every decade, the definition of leadership changed, down to the present. And so then I asked the question, was it culture that influenced leadership? Or was it leadership that influenced the culture? And when we really begin to look at how the definition changed, it really changed based upon what the individual faced during that particular period of time. Whether we're talking about the Depression, or we're talking about the idea of World War II, or we're talking about the Korean conflict, or we're talking about Vietnam, or we're talking about the days of the flower child and hippies and all the way to the present. I mean, it's interesting to see how definition has changed. John Maxwell, obviously most of you know him. In fact, there's a book right up here on the shelf by John Maxwell, which I'll make reference to later. But he basically narrowed leadership down to this. Leadership is influence. And in some ways, that's really true. I mean, it is about influence. But here's the way I chose to define leadership. Based upon the studies and material that I've read, leadership is a process. And I think that's kind of the critical component for me. It's a process. Leadership isn't just, okay, you wake up one day and all of a sudden you're a leader. It's a process that we go through. And when you study characters throughout the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, you find that they went through a process. Think about Moses. How long was the process for Moses before he led the children of Israel out of Egypt? 40 years in the wilderness. Yeah, and 40 years before that when he was in Egypt. And so you're talking about 80-year period of time that was a long process to prepare him for the task that God had called him to do. You think about Joseph down in Egypt, sold by his brothers into slavery. How long was the process before he came to the throne? I mean, couldn't God have just put him on the throne when he went to Egypt, bring his family down there and save him? No, it was at least 13 years, a process that was going on. And you know the interesting thing about the process for most of the people that we see who are leaders in Scripture? It wasn't a positive process. It was a wilderness process. I mean, they were wandering in the wilderness, or they were struggling through times in their life that helped groom and prepare them to be the leaders God needed them to be. But it's a process wherein godly men and women strive to influence the direction, alignment, and commitment of God's people to provide hope that things will be better. If I were going to say one thing about leadership, it's that last line. It's about giving people hope. That's what we're trying to do. Whether we're leading people out of the world into Christ or leading Christians to heaven, keeping them saved. I mean, it's about giving people hope that there is something better than this life. So if we can think about leadership in terms of the words that we've incorporated in the sentences that we put together, and really when we have a break here in just a minute, I want you to put them up so we can look at them throughout the day and be thinking about how leadership is defined, a word that we would use and how we would incorporate that word. So real quickly, let me describe what we're going to cover today, what we're going to achieve. You have this on your paper, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time with it because we're going to do this. We're going to talk about the past. We're going to talk about where we have been. What's happened in the past that's brought us to where we are. We're going to talk about the present. We're going to look at where we are right now. What are we facing right now? Then we're going to talk about the future. Where do we want to go? Where do we want to be in 10 years, 15 years? One congregation I know developed a 50-year vision. Where do we want to be? Have we even thought about where we want to be? So we'll talk about that. We want to talk about the journey. How do we plan to get there? We'll do that later on as we go through the day. Then we're going to evaluate who we are and who do we need to be in order to get to where we want to be. And then we're going to talk about the resources. What will we commit in order to get there? As a leader, it's going to require something of us. So we're going to talk about what that is and what we're willing to commit in order to get there. And how we're going to achieve this is by creating a vision, discovering our passion, sculpting our character, and strategic planning. That is, goals. These are the four basic areas. Several years ago, I met a man on the way back from Amsterdam. Got in this plane and this couple was wanting to sit together, and I happened to be in the middle of those four seats in the middle of the plane. It's the worst place you want to be on an overseas flight, I can tell you that. So this couple was coming down the aisle, and one of them happened to be sitting next to me, and then there was a guy on the outside aisle, and they asked if he would swap positions with them, and he said no. And I said, "Where are you sitting?" And she said, "On the window right behind you." And I was like, "I'll swap with you." So they wanted to sit together, and I didn't want to sit there, so it worked out well. So I got over in this seat next to the window, and I'm sitting down strapping up. And as soon as I looked at the guy next to me, he had his hand out. He said, "My name's Paul Cryer." I said, "Well, I'm Bob Turner." And so we started visiting. You talk about the providence of God. This guy trained leaders in the Cummins organization. He lives in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so we started talking, and I said, do you mind if I take some notes? And he said, no, go ahead. So I just started asking questions. I was trying to get as much as I possibly could from this guy. And I really wish we had a lot of time today, because I'd love to tell you his rules of marriage. They were good. But anyway, he started telling me about some of the things that they were doing in the Cummins organization. And so I'm writing all this stuff down, and he actually gave me a book before we got off the plane that he was just finished up, that they use as a part of some of their training. And so I have that at home, and it's incredible. So I was telling him that some of the thoughts of what I was beginning to develop at the time. Several years ago, I started studying some information in regards to food and the essential nature of food when it comes to life on this planet. And in that research, they mentioned that there are 4 essentials to life. 4 essentials to life that we have to have. We have to have the sun, we have to have food, we have to have water, and we have to have air. You can take away any one of those 4 and life doesn't exist. You just pick it. Doesn't matter. Take away the sun, life's gone. Take away air. We used to have an instructor that said it'd be easy for God to wipe out the planet. Just cut off oxygen for about 5 minutes and we'd all be gone. I mean, think about it. You have to have the sun, you have to have food, you have to have water, and you have to have air. And so I began thinking, okay, I've read all these books, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, 21 Indispensable Qualities, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And I started thinking, my goodness, can we not narrow it down to some essential components of leadership? And so I thought, well, if it's going to happen, I'm going to do it myself. And so I developed what I call the 4 essentials to leadership. And then I began to see how that they aligned with the 4 essentials of life. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the 4 essentials of life and leadership. I'm just going to briefly touch on the life part of it, and then we're going to focus on the leadership part of it. But I want you to know the basis for which we are moving forward and what we're going to be talking about as we go through the day. So we're going to begin with this idea of the first essential. The first essential to life is the sun. We have to have the sun. And you know, it's interesting, and really, the fact that God in creation put the earth in an orbit around the sun that was 93 million miles from the sun. The perfect distance in order for life to exist. They may be able to prove that they can put life on Mars, but I'm not getting on the ship. That ain't happening. Because they ain't going to have life on Mars. Not the way we have it here. Because the earth is the perfect distance. In fact, if the orbit of the earth around the sun was 1/10 of an inch closer or farther away, life wouldn't exist here. If it were closer, we'd be an inferno, and if we were further away, we'd be an ice block. I mean, God designed it perfectly so that in the orbit around the sun, life would exist on this earth. And so I began thinking about, okay, what is it then about leadership that aligns with the sun that would be essential for leaders? And one of you guys mentioned it earlier, and that's this idea of vision. Leaders have to have a vision. They have to be able to recognize where they've come from, but they have to be able to see where they are and see where they want to go. What is our vision for the future? And so I began putting some thoughts together and reading a bunch of material. In fact, I just happened to find in your library The Power of Vision. I've never read this book. So I started thumbing through it before you all got here. And I'm going to read you something from it in just a few moments. Biblically, in Proverbs chapter 29, in verse 18, Solomon said, where there is no vision, the people are unrestrained. Now think about that. And what does that mean for the church? Where there is no vision, the people are unrestrained. When Kerry and I first started talking about this particular seminar, I asked him what he wanted me to cover. And so we were talking about kind of the components, and he wanted me to do an overview. But I would encourage you, I have an entire seminar just on vision. I mean, we could have spent the whole day just talking about vision. Because here's the problem. I don't know many congregations that have a vision for the future. If you asked leadership, where are you going to be in 10 years? Here's the response I get. Well, I don't know. We plant, we water, God gives the increase. And that's their vision. And it's like, whoa. You know, God honors planning. And if we can't see it, then chances are we won't do it. We've got to have vision. So I began to put together some thoughts. I want to share with you some thoughts that I found about vision. Now, this one is the most fascinating to me. For those of you who know Helen Keller, you'll appreciate this thought. The only thing worse than being blind is being able to see and having no vision. Isn't that an interesting thought? The only thing worse than being blind is being able to see but having no vision. This one I thought was also interesting by P.K. Bernard. A man without a vision is a man without a future, and a man without a future will always return to his past. You know, one of the things that I've seen in the church that we struggle with so much is our past. We think about our life of sin, and even though we intellectually know that God has forgiven us, we don't live as though He has. We hold on to the guilt. I mean, it becomes this luggage, this baggage that we carry around that burdens us down. And the people on this earth that should be the happiest people, the most joyous people, no matter what we face, are Christians because of what God has done for us. And yet far too often we're not. We walk around as though it is, life is just such a burden. And it's like, man, we've got heaven. We should be happy people. Now, I'm not saying that everything in life is cartwheels and sun dancing and all that kind of stuff, but I am saying that there needs to be joy in our life. I've sat many times at the front looking back on the church while we're singing the song before I were to get up and preach, and you'd think we were at a funeral instead of a celebratory event. And we shouldn't be that way. Isn't that an interesting thought? A man without a vision is a man without a future. And a man without a future will always return to his past. And based upon this, I found another quote by Chris Valentin. And this is one that was just quoted to me recently after I shared this vision stuff with a congregation in Louisiana. This guy reminded me of this. He had remembered it 4 months later. That's how much it impacted him. If your memories are greater than your dreams, you're already dying. If your memories are greater than your dreams, then you're already dying. I don't know how many times I've heard people in the church say, you know, I remember once, back when the church was the #1 growing organization, the #1 religious body back in the 1950s. And I think that's great. I think we need to build on the past. But we can't use the same things in the same way and expect different results. What's that called? Insanity. And that's what's happened. See, our culture has changed around us, but we're still trying to use the same methodology that we used in the 1950s and won't work. The message never changes. Please do not misunderstand me. The truth never changes. But how we present that truth must change. Because if it doesn't, then we may already be dying. And if our memories, if we're living in the past, trying to relive the glory days, and that's greater than our dreams of where we're headed and what we're going to achieve, we're already dying. Vision. We need vision. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this because I have some stuff that we're going to do after we get through this first session. But I do want to point out that when we think about the idea of vision and why we need vision, the first reason is because it paints a picture of the future for our present circumstances. I'll never forget the first time I read a vision statement. It was actually it was a church at Bear Valley. When I first went to work there in 2008, they brought me their vision statement. And so I'm reading this statement, and I'm like, this is not true. Because it was written in a fashion that said, we have 1,200 members, 1,250 members. We have, I forget, it was like 25 elders, and we have 50 deacons, and we have 75 extension schools. And they were going through all this stuff, and I was like, This is not true. They do not have this. And then it was like a brick fell out of the sky and hit me in the head. Because the point of a vision statement is to paint a picture of the future as though it were present. It gives us something to be looking to. This is what we want to achieve. Now you need to be thinking about all of this, because in the next session, we're going to work in groups to write a vision. And so be thinking about this. It paints a picture of the future for our present. Secondly, it gives us purpose and direction. It gives us the why. I am convinced that one of the reasons the church struggles in so many ways today is because many people in the church don't understand the why. They understand, and we're good at understanding what we do, and we understand how to do it. Just ask anybody. They will tell you what we do to become a Christian. 5 steps, remember? Hear, believe, repent, confess, and be baptized. They'll tell you what we do in worship. We sing, we pray, we give, we take the Lord's Supper, and we have preaching. So we have the 5 steps to salvation, the 5 acts of worship, but there is not very many people who can tell you why we do that. They can even tell you how we do the Lord's Supper on the first day of every week, and that we sing without a mechanical instrument. And I agree. I'm saying all of that is true, it's biblical. But do we know why? Do we know why we do that? It makes people uncomfortable when I start asking them questions about why. Should I get myself in trouble on film, Gary?
Go for it.
We can't fire you, so it's good.
Okay.
And it can be edited, so.
It could be evidence, he said. Have you ever thought about why we meet Sunday night? Now, I want to preface this by saying, I am not opposed to Sunday night. I think it's great. We should meet more, not less. I mean, the early church met every day. There's our model. But have you ever thought about why? Why do we meet Sunday night? When did that start? Did it start in the first century? Why do we do it? Now, I understand the reasons that I've been given, and I know the culture at the time and why it started, but the culture has changed. So, why do we still do that today? Now again, I'm not opposed to Sunday night. I think it's great. We need to meet more, not less. I mean, you think about the average person lives 168 hours every week, and they get 4 of those around God's people. If they're here Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, they get 4 hours of that 168-hour week with God's people. We need to meet more, not less. But we need to understand why. When we have a vision, it provides us with purpose and direction. It helps us to understand why. And we're going to talk a lot more about that in just a few moments. It also drives the actions of our life and our church. You know, the thing about this study that we're doing today is not just for the church. It's for your life individually. Do you have a vision for your life? Do you know where you want to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Or do we just tend to get in a routine of we go to work, we come home. We go to work, we come home. Wednesday, we go to work, we go to church, we come home. Thursday, we go to... I mean, are we just in such a routine that we really have no vision for where we want to be in the future? You see, when we have a vision, it drives the actions of our life. We have a reason why we do what we do, individually and as the church. And then it powers enthusiasm and commitment. The people who are the most excited about life are the people who know where they're going in life. And that's true for the church too. You want to get people excited in the church? Give them a vision that they can sink their teeth into. They will connect. They'll get involved. And on top of that, it challenges us to do something great. Now, you know that thing about everything you read on the internet is true? And it's quoted by Abraham Lincoln. And so I realize that everything that is said about some of our previous presidents isn't necessarily true. And I don't know if this story is true or not, but I read it as being true about Abraham Lincoln. But I find it's just a powerful thought in connection to this last statement. Now, we do know that he was a religious man. He made a lot of great statements about the Bible and the power of the Bible to lead people.